Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. From the triumphs of Austerlitz to the frozen retreat from Moscow, this memoir thrusts you into the heart of the action. These are his words. Let's begin. Nothing could be more different than the duties of a staff officer and those of a line officer. Each knows what the other does not, and each is ignorant of what the other understands. The infantry officer, I speak of my own branch, knows how to command soldiers in marches, camps, and battles. Accustomed to living among them, he speaks their language, supports and encourages them, and ensures they get the rest they need. Yet especially at lower ranks, the line officer often has little understanding of broader military operations. His regiment marches without him knowing why. Even a simple word from a general can unsettle him. He may not realize that some orders are only meant to be partially executed, and he struggles to discern the moment when, left to his own devices, he must take the initiative. A staff officer, by contrast, working closely with generals, knows them as a company commander knows their soldiers. He sees the larger picture of movements and understands the intent of the orders he transmits. He learns how to soften the tone of a reprimand or adapt an occasionally unworkable order. However, he is often ignorant of the internal workings of a regiment and, most critically, the moral dimension that is particularly important in the French army. To him, a regiment is merely a machine to be moved at will, in any time or place. A military operation becomes like a chess game. Thus, to become a good general, or even a competent unit commander, it is essential to serve both in a regiment and on a staff. I cannot say which of the two experiences was more useful in my career. At the time of these events, I could consider my apprenticeship as a line officer complete after 2 uninterrupted years in the 59th Regiment. It was time to learn staff work, and I owe it to Marshal Ney's favour that I began this new school under his orders at such a critical juncture. When I joined the headquarters, I encountered a new kind of colleague. Staff officers are generally more polished than line officers. First, an officer with education or means often seeks to join the staff. The work is more agreeable, generals tend to favour their aides de camp, and they take an interest in their advancement. Secondly, working closely with higher-ranking officers, staff officers benefit from the knowledge these senior leaders have acquired. Let me describe the 6th Corps at that time, particularly Marshal Ney's aides de camp, with whom I worked closely. The 6th Corps now comprised 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade, a reduction from its composition at the Montreuil camp, where it also included the 1st Division under General Dupont. The extended stay at Montreuil had fostered trust among the regiments. Many officers formed friendships, and the capabilities of generals and staff officers were evaluated with the keen judgment that distinguishes French soldiers. The Austrian campaign had further strengthened these bonds, forged through shared glory, fatigue, and danger. Marshal Ney's rise to prominence transformed his immediate circle, and his aides de camp bore little resemblance to those of his earlier career as a Republican general. Among his staff were Labrume, squadron leader, witty, clever, and charming. Saint-Simon, lieutenant. Wealth elevated him above others, and his example brought refinement to the staff. D'Albignac, acting aide-de-camp. Though officially an adjutant in a dragoon regiment, his somewhat rough exterior concealed a kind heart and notable qualities. Cassin, private secretary to Ney. A man of intellect and integrity, his prudent advice often proved invaluable. Such was the staff I joined on October 6th near Nuremberg. We were already advancing against Prussia. Before continuing my journal, I must briefly outline the situation of the 2 armies and the campaign plan. Prussia, neutral in previous wars, had resolved to attack us, choosing a moment when Austria, defeated, could not join the fight. She counted on Russian support, but the Russian army was distant, leaving Prussia to face Napoleon alone, a mistake similar to Austria's in 1805 but even graver, given the lessons of Ulm and Austerlitz. Despite this, Frederick William III's court showed no fear. They dismissed the French army's success as due to reckless bravery and their enemies' incompetence. They believed their forces, inheritors of Frederick the Great's tactics, to be superior. Napoleon's army comprised 170,000 soldiers across 6 corps, with additional reserves bringing the total to 190,000. His plan aimed to cross the Elbe, isolate Saxony from Prussia, and strike into the heart of Prussia itself. Meanwhile, the Prussian army, numbering 180,000 with reserves, was divided between those advocating caution and those urging bold action. The decisive movements began with Napoleon feinting toward Leipzig, misleading the Prussians and creating confusion. The 6th Corps, forming part of the army's right flank, advanced steadily, following the 4th Corps. On October 6th, I met Marshal Ney at a chateau near Nuremberg. He received me warmly but paid no attention to whether I had the necessary resources for my new role. I lacked horses, equipment, and money. Yet, within this relentless march, I acquired a loyal horse and began my duties, learning through improvisation and persistence. By October 12th, we reached Alma, preparing for the coming engagements against the Prussian forces. On October 13th, we began heading in that direction, but the order came to veer further left toward Jena. These movements had a clear purpose. The French army was crossing the 3 defiles leading into Saxony, as I mentioned earlier. The centre and the left encountered the enemy and achieved decisive victories at Schleitz and, more notably, at Saalfeld. Meanwhile, the right wing, to which we belonged, the 4th and 6th Corps, advanced unopposed to Plauen and Hof. These 2 engagements threw the Prussian high command into disarray, not just because of the losses sustained, but because of the disorderly retreats of their columns and the evident demoralization, particularly among the Prussian and Saxon soldiers. Prince Hohenlohe, disheartened by the prospect of taking the offensive, withdrew behind the Saale. Napoleon quickly occupied the river crossings at Jena, Dornberg, and Naumburg to prevent the enemy from retreating across the Elbe and to force a decisive battle on the left bank if the enemy dared to remain there. However, the Duke of Brunswick misinterpreted Napoleon's strategy, believing he intended to march directly on the Elbe, envelop their forces, and trap them as General Mack had been at Ulm the previous year. Brunswick moved the main Prussian army from Weimar toward Naumburg, intending to force the Saale crossing and reach the Elbe between Torgau and Magdeburg, depending on circumstances. He instructed Prince Hohenlohe to defend the Saale crossing at Jena and then follow. General Rüschel would act as the rear guard, departing last from Weimar. Napoleon, fully aware of these movements, began concentrating his forces around Jena, ordering both the right and left wings of his army to converge toward the centre. This is why we successively changed direction from Plauen to Gera and then to Jena. On October 13th, as we marched, Marshal Ney, eager for updates, advanced ahead of his vanguard, while the 2 divisions followed some distance behind. At a small village 2 leagues from Roda, the Marshal received the following letter from the Major General. At the bivouac near Jena, October 13th, 4 p.m. The enemy has concentrated his forces between Jena and Weimar. Move your corps forward tonight, beyond Roda, and as close to Jena as possible to arrive by morning. Try to reach Jena yourself tonight to participate in the Emperor's reconnaissance of the enemy during the night. I rely on your zeal. Prince of Neufchâtel, Alexandre Berthier. Marshal Ney sent copies of this letter to Generals Colbert, Marchand, and Marcognet, and immediately set off for Jena with 2 officers who had horses capable of keeping up with him. I personally delivered the copy intended for General Colbert when he passed through the village where I had remained. He continued without stopping, passed through Roda, and arrived at Jena during the night, camping just outside the town. Marshal Ney's aides-de-camp spent the night in Roda, setting out at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 14th. Though eager to rejoin the Marshal, we rode at a slow pace to conserve our horses, which would face significant exertion later that day. While the Prussian army sought to cross the Saale to reach the Elbe, Napoleon planned to establish himself on the left bank to confront the concentrated Prussian forces. Marshals Bernadotte and Davout, 1st and 3rd Corps, were tasked with defending the Saale crossings at Dornburg and Naumburg. Meanwhile, Napoleon personally crossed the Saale at Jena to engage Prince Hohenlohe. On the evening of October 13th, Napoleon arrived in Jena and reconnoitred the position with Marshal Lannes, who had arrived earlier. The skirmishers of the 5th Corps had already seized key heights overlooking the town, where the 5th Corps and the Imperial Guard were stationed. Soldiers worked through the night to widen a narrow, steep road for the artillery. The Prussian army, positioned between Jena and Weimar, had an opportunity to drive the French into the Saale, but underestimated the situation. Prince Hohenlohe believed he faced only the 5th and 7th Corps, Lannes and Augereau, and expected an easy victory the next day. Both he and the Duke of Brunswick remained convinced that Napoleon was marching toward the Elbe, thus dismissing the threat of a serious attack on the left bank of the Saale. By the morning of October 14th, Marshal Lannes had pushed back General Tauenzien's vanguard and secured enough space on the plateau to deploy the army. Prince Murat arrived with the cavalry, and Marshals Ney and Soult were expected shortly. Recognizing the situation's gravity, Prince Hohenlohe hurried from Weimar with his entire army. Arriving at Jena late on October 13th, Ney's aides-de-camp searched for him in vain amid a thick fog. Lieutenant Saint-Simon encountered a Prussian squadron and narrowly escaped with 2 injuries, rejoining us later. Luckily, we found the Marshal at the head of his vanguard. Thanks to General Colbert's efficiency, the vanguard had crossed Jena during the night and camped on the heights near the Imperial Guard, positioned at the centre of the line, between the 5th Corps on the right and the 7th on the left. Prince Hohenlohe arrived at this critical moment with his full force. Marshal Ney attacked around 10 o'clock, reportedly without explicit orders from Napoleon. His vanguard, comprising the 25th Light Infantry, 2 battalions of elite companies, and the Light Cavalry Brigade, performed extraordinary feats of bravery. The 3rd Hussars and 10th Chasseurs charged repeatedly against a much larger Prussian cavalry force, protecting our vulnerable squares. Ney himself exposed himself to great danger, behaving more like a voltigeur corporal than a Marshal of France. Initially unsupported, the vanguard bore the brunt of the enemy's efforts. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. Marshal Lannes joined the fight, supported on the right by Soult and on the left by Augereau. The Prussian army began to falter. Napoleon ordered a general assault, supported by the Imperial Guard, resulting in a complete rout. Despite heroic efforts by the Prussian generals, including the late arrival of General Reuchel's corps from Weimar, their forces crumbled. Saxon brigades surrendered, and the French captured 15,000 prisoners and 200 cannons. Prince Murat entered Weimar amidst the fleeing soldiers, lodging in the palace where the Grand Duchess had remained. Marshal Ney followed closely, but refused to stay at the palace, despite ample space for everyone. He harboured an old grudge against Murat, feeling somewhat affronted by his princely title. Instead, he chose to stay in an inn on the edge of town. A general accompanying us at the time proposed measures to prevent looting, but such chaos is almost inevitable in an open city with soldiers exulting in victory and consumed by hunger. Our first priority was rest. Having mounted our horses at Roda at 2 in the morning, we dismounted in Weimar at 7 in the evening. Barely able to eat and already half asleep, I lay down on a wooden plank and slept until noon the next day. My Isabel horse bore the fatigue with commendable resilience. Fortuitously, amidst the battle, I had found a supply wagon in a ravine filled with oats, which I fed to him. That chance encounter likely saved both my companion's life and mine. Only the vanguard of the 6th Corps participated in the battle, while the 2 divisions arrived in Weimar during the night. Their delay was understandable, given that on October 13th they had been camping near Gera, and by the night of the 14th they had marched over 15 leagues to Weimar. Officers of the 59th Regiment recounted never having seen soldiers so utterly exhausted. It took them half an hour just to muster the energy to light fires and forage for food. The main Prussian army was retreating toward Naumburg, seeking to cross the Saale and continue its withdrawal. Marshal Davout's Third Corps was tasked with denying them passage, while Marshal Bernadotte was to hold Dornburg between Jena and Naumburg and support Davout. Bernadotte, however, received word of the entire Prussian army's approach, but insisted on moving to Dornburg, where it was clear he would be ineffective. He justified this by citing the Emperor's orders, though these were conditional on circumstances. If jealousy toward Davout, whom he reportedly despised, influenced his decision, it backfired spectacularly. This error granted Davout the opportunity to achieve lasting glory. Davout's force consisted of only 3 infantry divisions and 3 regiments of light cavalry, totaling scarcely 26,000 men. Positioned on the plateaus dominating the left bank of the Saale near the village of Hassenhausen, he repelled repeated infantry assaults and cavalry charges, ultimately forcing the Prussians to retreat in good order. 2 unengaged Prussian divisions provided cover for their withdrawal. Plans for a renewed attack faltered when King Frederick William III, who had personally fought valiantly that day, grew alarmed at the devastating losses inflicted by an opponent so vastly outnumbered. Discouraged by the deaths of the Duke of Brunswick and Marshal Mullendorf, both killed at his side, he decided to withdraw. Hoping to join forces with Prince Hohenlohe, whom he believed victorious at Jena, or at least capable of covering his retreat, the king marched toward Weimar. However, he soon encountered the shattered remnants of Hohenlohe's army, seeking refuge with his own. Both forces retreated in utter disarray, some toward Erfurt, others veering right toward Sommeda. The Battle of Auerstedt saw 26,000 French soldiers face 70,000 Prussians, leaving 10,000 Prussians dead or wounded, 3,000 captured, and 115 cannons seized. The evening before this decisive engagement, Napoleon responded to King Frederick William III's ultimatum to retreat across the Rhine, issued at the war's onset. "Sire," he wrote, "this letter is not from you. It was dictated by schemers and agitators. Let us make peace. It is still time. Your Majesty will be defeated. Let her recall that I gave the same counsel to the Emperor of Russia on the eve of Austerlitz." This prophecy was fulfilled with extraordinary speed. On September 25th, we were still quartered in Swabia without orders to march. By October 15th, the Prussian army was annihilated, and the monarchy left defenseless. The French army's superiority over its Prussian counterpart is understandable, but the latter's complete destruction is astonishing. This stemmed from Napoleon's mastery of maneuver warfare, his skill in misleading the enemy about his intentions, and the rapidity with which his dispersed corps converged on the battlefield before dispersing again to pursue the defeated. In contrast, the Prussian army, rooted in 7 years' war traditions, maneuvered methodically, burdened by extensive baggage trains. For them, a march of 5 or 6 leagues constituted a full day's effort. Meanwhile, the French army, unencumbered by logistics, covered vast distances, often leaving devastation in its wake. Napoleon's forces often surprised the enemy with their sudden appearances, exploiting the illusion of strength created by forward elements carrying the name of an entire corps. Moreover, the Prussian army, long unaccustomed to war, faced a French army emboldened by victories and convinced of its invincibility. On October 15th, Napoleon arrived in Weimar, where the Grand Duchess, whose husband served in the Prussian army, received him with courage and dignity. He convened captured Saxon officers, expressing his desire for peace with their sovereign. However, his treatment of the Elector of Hesse was harsher. He seized the latter's territories. Depriving Prussia of its allies, Napoleon then capitalized on his victories, relentlessly pursuing the remnants of the Prussian army to prevent its reorganization. The Third Corps, Davout, Fifth Corps, Lannes, and Seventh Corps, Augereau, which had suffered the most, took a few days of rest. The First Corps, Bernadotte, advanced towards the Elbe, passing through Halle and Dessau, thereby forming the army's right flank. The Fifth Corps, Soult, pursued the defeated army through Thuringia via Sommard and Nordhausen. On the evening of the 15th, Prince Murat, followed by Marshal Ney, arrived in front of Erfurt and demanded its surrender. The Marshal expressed significant irritation at still being accompanied by Prince Murat, who was poised to claim the honour of capturing Erfurt. This conquest rightfully belonged to Ney, as he commanded the infantry. Therefore he appointed General Dutailis, his chief of staff, as governor of the city, entrusting him with negotiating the terms. However, the Emperor promptly sent General Clark with full authority. At the very least, we spent a pleasant day in excellent accommodations. In Erfurt, we captured 15,000 Prussians, 6,000 of whom were wounded, along with considerable material and spoils. As I have already mentioned, the pursuit of the Prussian army was relentless and effective in every direction. The Fourth Corps moved towards Magdeburg, passing through Langensalza, Nordhausen, Halberstadt, and Wansleben. The Sixth Corps followed a day behind. Never had an army been pursued more relentlessly or completely defeated. Even a skilled general would have struggled to rally 10,000 Prussians, and the Emperor, far surpassing Hannibal, excelled at both victory and its exploitation. However, during this pursuit, pillaging reached an unprecedented level, and disorder escalated to outright insubordination. At Nordhausen, for instance, Colonel Jomini and I narrowly escaped being killed by soldiers whose excesses we tried to curb. We had to draw our swords and race through the town to restore order. The Marshal reported the incident to the Emperor, requesting authorization to set severe examples if necessary. This incident illustrates how dangerous it is to allow soldiers to shake off the yoke of discipline and how challenging it becomes to rein them in once they take the first step towards disobedience. The structure of subordination in our army lacked the solid foundations found in some foreign armies. In those, the soldier is treated as a slave and the officer as a master. In our army, on the contrary, the soldier obeys the officer as his superior, but is aware of the respect he is owed in return. The soldier knows he is just as much a man as the officer. The officer has often been a soldier himself, and the soldier knows he can rise to become an officer. This creates a kind of equality of rights between them, almost akin to that between a colonel and an officer. This dynamic must always be kept in mind when dealing with our soldiers. They must be treated with firmness, but without harshness, with kindness, but without weakness. Harshness irritates them, while weakness provokes their mockery. It is this balance, this middle ground, this paternal fraternity, if one might call it so, that our officers instinctively practice rather than calculate. It is a practice foreign officers could never emulate, for only Frenchmen can command Frenchmen. On leaving Nordhausen on the 19th to head toward Halberstadt, the 6th Corps marched in 2 columns, with the headquarters and the 1st Division taking the Harzefeld route, while the 2nd Division went through Bennekenstein. The first route was full of narrow passes, where 10,000 men could have easily held off a much larger army. However, the Prussians lacked either the time or the foresight to defend these strategic points, preoccupied as they were with fleeing toward Magdeburg at full speed. The Corps regrouped in Halberstadt on the 20th and continued as one unit to Hamersleben on the 21st and Grosswansleben on the 22nd. Marshal Soult, who had departed Nordhausen ahead of us, was already in Grosswansleben, initiating the encirclement of Magdeburg. Upon our arrival, we assumed responsibility for the siege, while Marshal Soult crossed the Elbe at Tangermünde, north of Magdeburg, to proceed toward Berlin. Marshal Ney established his headquarters in Schönebeck, 2 leagues from Magdeburg, and began the investment of the city on November 25th. General Kleist, an octogenarian in poor health and barely able to mount a horse, responded to the initial summons by asserting that he could not surrender without proof that sufficient means existed to compel him. However, the weakened and demoralized garrison, the number of wounded and sick within the city, the discontent of the townspeople fearing sacrifice for a lost cause, all these factors suggested that a prolonged and determined defence was unlikely. Marshal Ney nevertheless prepared for the siege as if confronting a formidable enemy. Soon the investment was complete. The two divisions occupied the left bank of the Elbe from Farmersleben to Barleben, connected by a pontoon bridge to the right bank, held by General Colbert and the vanguard. Although lacking siege artillery, a few mortars sent from Erfurt sufficed. The city was threatened with bombardment, beginning with the burning of Krakow village, which the defenders had occupied on the right bank. Realizing his position was untenable, that Berlin was in French hands, and that further resistance would neither save Prussia nor yield any gain other than the destruction of the city and harsher terms for its defenders, the governor opted to capitulate, a decision that, while arguably condemnable, reflected the despair instilled by the defeat at Jena and the fall of Prussia. It was agreed that the city would be surrendered to the French. Officers and non-commissioned officers were allowed to return home on parole with their arms, while the soldiers became prisoners of war. On the eve of our entry into Magdeburg, Marshal Ney reviewed the corps. The troops looked magnificent. Afterward, we paid a visit to the governor, who received us courteously. The conversation touched on the misfortunes of war, the imprudence of the Prussian government, particularly the Queen, who had incited the ill-fated campaign, the merits of the Prussian troops, and the wisdom of the governor in avoiding an unnecessary defence. The next morning the army assembled early. The two infantry divisions formed in battle lines faced the ramparts, with the left flank of the 59th Regiment positioned opposite the gate through which the garrison would exit. Colbert's brigade anchored its left at the same gate. Marshal Ney, along with his staff, stood to the right of the brigade, completing the square's formation alongside the infantry. The entire army displayed perfect decorum. At the appointed hour, the garrison marched out, with generals and colonels leading their troops. General Kleist, standing beside Marshal Ney, introduced each senior officer as they saluted in passing. The garrison filed past, presenting arms to the sound of French military music, before turning left to pass the infantry and lay down their arms on the line's right. Cavalry followed the infantry. Altogether, the garrison numbered 18,000 men. It was one of the most magnificent triumphs I had ever witnessed, made even more splendid by the brilliant sunlight. The Prussian officers appeared overwhelmed with sorrow. To compound their humiliation, some were insulted by their own soldiers as the latter surrendered their weapons and parted ways. Divided into 3 columns, the prisoners departed immediately for Mainz, escorted by detachments from all regiments under General Roguet's command. Tragically, the prisoners marched over 12 leagues on their first day. We entered Magdeburg, where the 50th and 59th regiments formed the garrison, while the remaining forces were quartered in nearby areas. Shortly thereafter, the 6th Corps headed to Berlin, leaving the 59th Regiment stationed in Magdeburg. During the siege of Magdeburg, other corps completed the destruction of the Prussian army and the conquest of the territory. Though it is beyond my scope to recount these events in detail, I will summarize for those following the broader campaign. On October 20th, 6 days after the Battle of Jena, Marshal Bernadotte's 1st Corps crossed the Elbe at Barbie, Marshal Lannes' 5th Corps at Dessau, and Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps at Wittenberg. The honour of entering Berlin first was reserved for Davout as a reward for his victory at Auerstedt. Reports suggest he declined the keys to the city and a palace residence, intending to present them to Napoleon. However, it is also said that he accepted a donation of 1 million francs, which he contributed to Berlin's hospitals, a gesture befitting his character. Meanwhile, Spandau surrendered without resistance the same day. Despite the fragmentation of the Prussian army, it still had potential to regroup and fight had it been given time. Such an army of 170,000 men is not destroyed in mere days. Yet, relentless pursuit by Murat's cavalry and Lannes's infantry ensured that even this hope was extinguished. Thus, the first phase of the 1806 campaign ended triumphantly. Before delving into the winter campaign against the Russians, I will detail the daily realities of service as an aide-de-camp. Marshal Ney maintained a significant distance from his aides de camp. During marches, he rode ahead alone, seldom addressing us unless necessary. The aide-de-camp on duty only entered his chamber for official matters or upon explicit summons, which was exceedingly rare. The marshal dined alone and never extended invitations to any of us. This aloofness stemmed from his elevated rank and his determination to maintain it. The transition from being a general of the Republic to becoming a marshal of the Empire had been abrupt. In 1796, during the era of the French Directory, General Augereau criticized officers for addressing one another as Monsieur. Yet a few years later, these Republican generals became marshals, dukes, and princes. This rapid change often left the new marshals feeling awkward, and Ney, conscious of the envy his rise provoked, believed that strict formality was necessary to command respect. However, this sometimes led him to excessive hauteur. Despite this distance, we aides-de-camp did not complain. Living together allowed us to enjoy camaraderie and the lively cheerfulness characteristic of French youth, particularly in the military. Meals were often sumptuous, thanks to the resourcefulness of our cooks. Even in the most meagre accommodations, they managed to prepare dinners that would not have been out of place in Paris. This indulgence, however, had its drawbacks. Detached from the day-to-day operations, we remained uninformed of critical orders, leaving us unable to fully learn our roles or effectively carry out assignments. The difficulty of missions often arose from a lack of preparation. For instance, at the start of the Magdeburg siege, I was tasked one morning with delivering a message to a general commanding a division of dragoons temporarily attached to the 6th Corps. He was reportedly stationed in Aiglun, 4 leagues from the headquarters in Schönebeck. Upon arrival, I learned that he had relocated 3 days earlier to Kloster Meyendorf, 6 leagues north. Setting off immediately, I reached Kloster Meyendorf in the evening, only to find he had departed that morning for Gross Salza, 6 leagues south, on the opposite side of Magdeburg. My horse needed rest, so I stayed briefly in Kloster Meyendorf, a large convent recently plundered by French soldiers. Despite this, I found a decent supper and departed at nightfall. Passing through Grosswansleben and Suldorf, I finally arrived in Gross Salza and located the general. Such frequent relocations without notification were frustrating and disruptive, yet the general faced no reprimand. Upon my return, Marshal Ney merely shrugged and remarked, "What a way to serve." Major missions were undertaken by carriage, often using requisitioned horses. Some officers pocketed the allocated travel funds, leading to delays and inefficient transportation. For horseback missions, little regard was given to whether we had serviceable mounts, knowledge of the terrain, or even maps, which we almost always lacked. Orders had to be executed regardless of circumstances, a practice I will highlight in future examples. This approach of attempting everything with minimal resources, fueled by unwavering confidence in success, was initially a strength but ultimately became a liability. During my solo journey from Magdeburg to Berlin, I had the rare opportunity to visit Potsdam and explore Frederick the Great's residence, a pleasure seldom afforded in war. Afterward, we rested briefly in Berlin, preparing for the next campaign, the details of which I will now recount. That concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.